Have you ever wanted to start a podcast and launch it on iTunes and then use your Adobe Business Catalyst website as the way to manage the RSS feed and the files? Well, then this video is for you. We're going to set this up in an easy to use manner that even non-technical people can manage. This is Mike Salander with the BC Academy. Now, before we dive into the specifics, I want to point out one thing that is really important on how to go about this. So iTunes says that the files need to be hosted on a server that supports byte range requests. All you need to know is that Business Catalyst does support this if and only if you upload the file using the file manager or through FTP or the developer console or through a web app's insert form. Basically, what it does not allow is using the media downloads module to store the files. So besides that, we should be good to go. Now let's take a look at the iTunes documentation. This video isn't meant to take you from start to finish through everything that is required to create a podcast. Rather, we're going to be focusing on just the file management component of this and how to set up the RSS feed. First, you need to make sure you're creating your episode in the required format as indicated here. Second is we need to create an RSS feed, which is something that we're going to do. Third, create your cover art. 4, post the RSS feed with the information. And then 5, submit your RSS feed. A section that I feel is really helpful is the overview of the different fields and what they mean and how they show up in iTunes. And you can see this below. Underneath this, you'll see how it looks on a mobile device. And then you'll see each of the fields and what's required or what's available on the channel level and the item level and a brief description of what they are. If you click on it, such as publish date, you'll be taken down to a section of the page that defines in more detail how this is supposed to be formatted. The good news is we've done a lot of the work for you, and all you have to do is worry about supplying the information, and we've coded in the back end the proper formats. So in this video, we're going to go through and talk about how we set this up and then go through the client interface of how to add it. Let's first take a look at the client interface. Now let's pretend here that the BC Academy was launching a podcast and I've uploaded 2 example episodes. Now if I wanted to add another episode, I'm going to go to add item. I can specify the item name. I can upload the file, pick the file type, choose the title, the publish date, the author, upload an image or select an image that already exists, enter in the duration, say whether or not this is a clean or explicit episode, select the order. This would override the order, otherwise it's going to order by publish date. I can put in a subtitle, a summary, a GUID. So this is this is an ID that should never change and should be identified to this episode. You do not have to specify it. If you do not, it will use the URL of the episode of the file as kind of the unique identifier. But if that file may change over time, or if you just want a specific string that is not going to change that represents this, you can put it in here. And then we have a couple check boxes. One is block. So if I want to make sure that this episode, for whatever reason, doesn't show up on the iTunes podcast, then I can check that. And if there's closed captioning available for this, I can check this. So taking a look at the back end, how we set up the web app is pretty simple. Underneath here, we're going to say allow file upload, and we can choose a different default folder if we would like, but I just kept the root for now. Under the fields, you'll see that we've set up a variety of these different custom fields. Now, most of these are pretty self-explanatory. A file is a media field. The file type is a drop-down list, and if you actually look at the documentation, you notice that these are not the actual values that need to get placed into the file. However, this is much more readable for a user, and then we'll use Liquid on the back end to change an MP3 into the technical version it needs to be in the file. Title is a string, publish date we have as a date time, and so on and so forth. All right, our end result RSS file may look something like this. Now, it's important to understand how iTunes works. iTunes requires you to place the RSS file on a separate server and host the files separate from iTunes. So iTunes is just going to read this RSS file, and then it's going to put the items into its podcast library based off of what's on here. So you need to define a variety of different things. You need to define both information about the channel and about each individual podcast episode, which is represented as an item. So let's take a quick look at some of the items we've included here as part of the channel. So these are things that you're going to actually have to go into the RSS file itself to edit, but thankfully the channel really only needs to be set up once. It's the items that are added over time. So we have things such as a title, a link to your website, the language, the copyright, subtitle, author, summary, owner, including the name and the email, the image for the channel. This is really important. And then any categories that the channel should show up in. And I encourage you to refer to the iTunes documentation for what categories there are and exactly how these should be formatted. The next piece is the episodes. And you'll notice that I have one example one in here. Now, one of the drawbacks currently of Business Catalyst is that we cannot output any dynamic functionality inside of RSS feeds or inside of XML files. So this part is a little bit manual, but I think we've done our best here to make it as user-friendly as possible. So what ends up happening is that we need to create essentially an HTML file that will output the right HTML that I just need to then copy and paste into my RSS feed. So now what do I mean by that? Well, here is the back end of my RSS file. And you'll notice it's all static. There is no tags in here like I was talking about. But what I've done inside of my website is I've created an itunes.htm file. And in here, I'm outputting the web apps of those podcast episodes and listing all of them. And if we preview this page, you'll see that it's outputting the necessary XML that I need to put into that RSS feed. And so if I want to add this newest episode for Building BC Apps live chat app, I can just copy this, come back into whatever FTP editor I want or this develop panel, go over to this iTunes RSS, and just add this new item below. And then click Save. Now, when iTunes reads this file again, we will have a second episode up there with all the corresponding information. So how do we get this iTunes.html file to output that necessary information? Well, we do that in the web app list layout, and I'll show you that now. So for the most part, I think this is pretty straightforward, but we're using, there's a couple things to notice. One is that we're using Liquid to run a case statement on the file type. So remember I said that selecting MP3 is a lot more friendly than selecting audio/MPEG. Well, here's where we do that. So if the user selects MP3, then we're going to assign a variable called new file type over to this audio MPEG format, and so on and so forth down the rest of the different file types. And then we are choosing a default state that said, for whatever reason, if none of these are selected, we're setting the audio MPEG, the MP3 one, as the default. So then you'll see down below where we have the enclose URL, we have a parameter here called type, and that's where we're putting the reference to the new file type. You might be looking at this code and wondering, why does it look so strange? Why do I have these values here instead of less than and greater than signs? Well, the reason is we want to make sure that this doesn't get outputted as HTML behind the scenes, but rather as text that appears on the page that I can easily copy and paste. So what I've done here is I've exchanged out the normal symbols with the ASCII values. And I can look up the ASCII values here on this one website, or there are several others, but then you can go here and you can see that a less than sign is the ampersand pound 60 and a semicolon. So that's great, because then when this actually renders, out in the browser, it's the less than sign, and it creates the look of HTML without actually outputting HTML behind the scenes. So if I view the page source, you'll see that it's still this. Some other small tweaks that I made is I wanted to put a BR or a line break at the end of every one of these so that I have it nicely formatted on the page right here. And then also when at the end I have 2 breaks so that it's easier to distinguish between each of the episodes. You'll notice that I have a couple liquid statements in here just to make sure that the user has specified the information before outputting it. So you'll see the GUID as one of those elements, the block, so I'm making sure that someone has checked that box in order to output this, and if they do, I need to put yes in here per the specifications of the iTunes documentation. Same thing goes for is closed captioning, and then the order I'm only outputting if the user has specified something other than 0, meaning that they want to override the order that this is going instead of the published date. One additional thing to notice in here is that I need to output the date in the correct format that iTunes wants it. And so here's the liquid that outputs it correctly. And one thing you will need to update or may want to update is the time zone. So here I have Central Standard Time. Now you could just say that you don't want to specify a time at all, and you might just put some default time in some time zone just so you don't have to worry about it. So it's up to you, but this is the correct format in which iTunes need it. So this is an important piece in order to convert the date that was entered into the correct standard. And you can see the output of the date here. So as a quick recap, what the user would do if they wanted to manage their podcast on iTunes is they'd go over to podcast episodes, they would add their item, they would then go over to the iTunes page, copy the latest item that they want, or they could copy all of them. And then they would need to go to the RSS feed and then add the new item below. Click save, and then once iTunes refreshes and views this file again, your new podcast will be up on iTunes. I hope you enjoyed watching this video and learning about how to use Adobe Business Catalyst to power your iTunes podcast and act as both the RSS feed and the server for the files. This has been Mike Salander with the BC Academy, and please leave any feedback or comments in the comment section below. Thanks again for watching the video.